How do you feel about that?
Well, naturally, I'm disturbed by it. It's very uncomfortable.
Death of Princess Grace. Now an intensive investigation says it's found the final truth.
A winding mountain road, a sudden loss of control, and a terrifying plunge off a cliff. In a single second in 1982, the world's greatest fairy tale shattered. Everyone knows the Hollywood star who became a princess, but few look at the man she left behind. For Prince Rainier, the true heartbreak didn't just start with that crash. It was the quiet, suffocating reality that followed. What really happened when the cameras stopped rolling? The Sovereign and the Starlet. The year was 1955, and the tiny principality of Monaco was suffocating. To the rest of the world, this sun-drenched speck of land on the French Riviera was a place of myth and old-world glamour. But behind the palace walls, Prince Rainier III was facing a cold, hard reality. Monaco was broke. The legendary Monte Carlo casino, which had funded the state for generations, was losing money as tourists flocked to newer, flashier destinations. The country lacked modern infrastructure. Its treasury was draining, and the shadow of World War II still hung heavy over its economy. To make matters worse, Rainier was trapped in a political chokehold by France. A centuries-old treaty dictated that if a reigning prince of Monaco died without a legitimate male heir, the principality would lose its independence and become a protectorate of France. The French government was watching, waiting for the ancient Grimaldi line to fail. Rainier was 32 years old, unmarried, and carrying the weight of an entire nation's survival on his shoulders. He didn't just need a wife. He needed a miracle. He needed an influx of cash, a sudden burst of global attention, and a bloodline to secure his throne. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Grace Kelly was living a life that seemed entirely detached from the dusty politics of European royalty. At 25, she was the undisputed queen of Hollywood. She possessed an icy, elegant beauty that captivated directors like Alfred Hitchcock, who made her his ultimate muse.
Well, time is running short again. So the award for the best performance by an actress? Grace Kelly.
Grace had just won an Academy Award for her raw, unglamorous performance in The Country Girl. She was wealthy, fiercely independent, and fiercely pursued by the media. Yet, beneath the surface of her brilliant career, Grace was growing deeply exhausted. The grueling studio system of old Hollywood controlled her schedule, her contract, and her public image. She was tired of the relentless gossip columns, the intrusive photographers, and the string of failed relationships with older, complicated co-stars that her deeply conservative, Catholic family continuously disapproved of. She was looking for a way out, a way to reinvent herself on her own terms. The universe, or perhaps a few very clever matchmakers, intervened in the spring of 1955. Grace was attending the Cannes Film Festival, just a short drive down the coast from Monaco. The French magazine Paris Match conceived a publicity stunt, a staged meeting between America's top movie queen and Monaco's bachelor prince. The meeting almost didn't happen. Grace's schedule was tight. A power outage at her hotel left her hair damp and her clothes unpressed, and Rainier was notoriously late to his own palace. When they finally met in the palace gardens, the chemistry was quiet but undeniable. They walked through the private zoo, chatted amiably, and caught the attention of photographers whose flashes captured the very beginning of a geopolitical shift. When Grace returned to America, the connection didn't fade. They began a quiet, intense correspondence through letters. To Grace, Rainier represented stability, a high social standing that would finally satisfy her demanding millionaire father, and a noble escape from the superficiality of Hollywood. To Rainier, Grace was the answer to every single one of his political and economic prayers. She was beautiful, she was Catholic, she was capable of bearing children, and she possessed a level of fame that money simply could not buy. By December of 1955, Rainier crossed the ocean, ostensibly for a vacation, but realistically to claim his bride. He arrived at the Kelly family home in Philadelphia under the intense scrutiny of the American press. The courtship was brief, calculated, and treated more like a high-stakes corporate merger than a romance. Before an engagement could even be announced, the business terms had to be settled. Rainier demanded a dowry. It was an ancient royal custom, but to the self-made Kelly family, it was a massive financial transaction. After intense negotiations, Jack Kelly agreed to pay a staggering $2 million, half of which came directly out of Grace's personal theatrical earnings. It was the price of admission into European royalty. On January 5, 1956, the engagement was made official, and the world went absolutely wild. The scale of the media frenzy that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The press treated the upcoming nuptials not as a state event, but as the ultimate romance movie brought to life. In April of 1956, Grace Kelly boarded the ocean liner SS Constitution in New York Harbor, waving goodbye to America. She brought with her 80 pieces of luggage, her beloved poodle, Oliver, and a massive entourage of bridesmaids, family members, and over 100 journalists. When the ship arrived in the waters of Monaco 8 days later, Prince Rainier met her on his private yacht, while thousands of citizens cheered from the cliffs. And Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping tycoon who held massive investments in Monaco, rained red and white carnations down from a private plane. The wedding itself, held on April 19, 1956, was quickly dubbed the Wedding of the Century. Over 30 million people watched the television broadcast, a staggering number for the era. The small St. Nicholas Cathedral was packed with movie stars, diplomats, and royalty, all suffocating under the heat of massive television lights that the studio had installed. Grace looked breathtaking in a gown made of Brussels lace and thousands of hand-stitched pearls, a gift from MGM Studios, which had demanded the rights to film the wedding in exchange for releasing Grace from her film contract. But behind the sea of smiling faces, the endless champagne toasts, and the romantic music, the atmosphere was fraught with tension. Rainier was visibly stressed, agitated by the sheer volume of journalists who had invaded his quiet principality, trampling garden beds and harassing guests. Grace was exhausted, running on just a few hours of sleep, her hands shaking so badly during the ceremony that Rainier had to help her steady the ring. They were two strangers who had spent less than a few weeks in each other's physical company, now bound together forever before a global audience of millions. The cameras captured a flawless, glittering fairy tale, but as the echoes of the cathedral bells faded and the tourists began to pack up their bags, the heavy iron gates of the palace swung shut. How long could an American movie star survive in a palace where tradition mattered more than truth? A heartbreaking turn. The honeymoon did not last long and was not great for the prince. Once the reporters packed up their cameras and the mountains of red and white flowers withered in the Mediterranean sun, a heavy, quiet isolation settled over the prince's palace. Grace Kelly, the independent Hollywood icon who was used to setting her own schedule, controlling her own career, and moving freely through New York and Los Angeles, suddenly found herself living inside a 225-room fortress. She was no longer Grace. She was Her Serene Highness Princess Grace of Monaco, and every single move she made was governed by a strict, centuries-old Spanish court etiquette that felt more like a prison sentence than a royal privilege. The cultural clash between the new princess and her adopted country was immediate and deeply painful. Grace did not speak French fluently when she arrived, a deficit that made her an outsider in her own home. The Monegasque palace staff and the local aristocracy treated her with a cold, passive-aggressive hostility. To them, she was an American interloper, a Hollywood actress who had bought her way into an ancient European dynasty with a $2 million check. They gossiped about her accent, criticized her American manners, and bristled at her attempts to modernize the dusty, dark interiors of the palace. Grace found herself surrounded by people she could not trust, in a country where she could barely communicate, feeling profoundly alone. Rainier, meanwhile, was consumed by the grueling work of statecraft. He was a complex man with a famously volcanic temper, deeply stressed by the political maneuverings of France and the economic instability of his realm. While he loved Grace, He did not know how to handle an American wife who was suffering from severe culture shock. He expected her to adapt completely, to erase her past life, and to step quietly into the role of a traditional European consort. To ensure this total transformation, Rainier took a drastic step that deeply wounded Grace. He banned all of her movies from being shown anywhere within the borders of Monaco. The vibrant, creative life she had built over a decade in Hollywood was effectively treated as a dark secret that needed to be locked away. Despite the emotional friction, Grace fulfilled her most critical state duty with remarkable speed. In January of 1957, less than a year after the wedding, she gave birth to Princess Caroline. 14 months later, in March of 1958, the principality erupted in joy when she gave birth to Prince Albert, the highly anticipated male heir who officially saved Monaco from being absorbed by France. A third child, Princess Stephanie, would arrive in 1965. On paper, the fairy tale was complete. Rainier had his heir, Monaco had its future, and Grace had her beautiful family. But motherhood, while deeply fulfilling to Grace, could not entirely fill the creative void that was slowly hollowed out inside her. She missed the electricity of a film set. She missed the intellectual stimulation of working with brilliant minds, and she missed having a purpose that belonged entirely to her, rather than to the crown. The breaking point came in the spring of 1962. Alfred Hitchcock, who had never given up on his favorite blonde muse, traveled to Monaco with a script that he had written specifically for her. Mourning, a psychological thriller about a troubled, compulsive thief. For Grace, the offer was a lifeline. It was a chance to step back into the light, to prove to herself that she was still an artist, and to escape the suffocating routine of royal ribbon cuttings for just a few months. Rainier, surprisingly, gave his consent. He recognized his wife's deep unhappiness and thought a temporary return to Hollywood might lift her spirits, especially since Monaco's financial situation was improving. When the palace officially announced that Princess Grace would be returning to the screen, the reaction was swift, brutal, and entirely unexpected. The people of Monaco were deeply offended. To them, it was unseemly for their sovereign princess to play a criminal on screen, to be kissed by a Hollywood leading man like Sean Connery, or to work for a paycheck. The French press mocked the principality, suggesting that Monaco must be completely broke if its princess had to go back to work. The international media erupted in a frenzy of speculation, claiming that the marriage was falling apart and that Grace was fleeing her royal duties. The pressure on the palace became unbearable. Rainier realized that the film project was threatening the very political stability and dignity he had spent his entire life trying to build. He had to back down, and Grace was forced to make a devastating choice. With a broken heart, she called Hitchcock and officially withdrew from the film. It was a defining moment in her life. She realized, with crushing clarity, that the heavy iron gates of the palace had truly locked shut. Grace Kelly, actress, was officially dead, buried beneath the weight of her crown. This devastating loss of identity permanently altered the dynamic between Grace and Rainier. The marriage entered a long, chilly winter. Outwardly, they maintained the flawless image of a united, glamorous royal couple traveling the world to promote Monaco. Inwardly, they grew increasingly distant. Grace channeled her profound frustration and restless creative energy into charity work, establishing the Princess Grace Foundation to support local artists and throwing herself into the minutiae of palace life. She became a master at masking her true feelings, perfecting the icy, serene smile that the world expected to see. But behind closed doors, the arguments between the fiery prince and the lonely princess became more frequent. Grace began spending more and more time away from Monaco, buying an apartment in Paris, and staying there for months at a time under the guise of educating her children. She surrounded herself with a tight-knit circle of American friends and artists, clinging desperately to any piece of her old world that she could find. She had saved a kingdom, but the cost of that salvation was the total erasure of her true self. Could a marriage built on a foundation of compromise and stolen identity survive the turbulent decades ahead? The Miracle of Monaco. While the private corridors of the palace grew increasingly cold, the world outside those high stone walls was witnessing a staggering economic resurrection. The marriage between the sovereign prince and the Hollywood starlet may have exacted a heavy psychological toll on the couple, but as a business strategy, it was an unprecedented masterclass. By the mid-60s, the Grace Kelly effect had completely transformed Monaco from a fading, bankrupt gambling port into the undisputed, ultra-luxury tax haven of the global elite. The strategy was brilliant in its execution. Before Grace's arrival, Monaco relied almost entirely on the roulette wheels of the Monte Carlo casino to fund the state. Rainier, with the financial backing and sharp business acumen of Aristotle Onassis, realized that the gambling model was dead. They needed to pivot. Together, they reimagined Monaco not as a place to gamble money, but as a place to hide it, protect it, and flaunt it. They systematically eliminated income tax for residents, slashed corporate taxes, and created highly secretive banking laws that made the principality an irresistible magnet for the world's multimillionaires, shipping tycoons, and corporate magnates. But lower taxes alone do not build a global brand. You need a face to sell the dream. Grace Kelly was that face. Her presence brought an organic, priceless aura of American glamour and old Hollywood prestige that no advertising campaign could ever replicate. Suddenly, the world's wealthiest individuals didn't just want to keep their money in Monaco, they wanted to live there. They wanted to dock their massive yachts in Port Hercules, dine at the Hotel de Paris, and rub shoulders with a real-life Oscar-winning princess at the annual Red Cross Ball. This massive influx of foreign capital triggered an unprecedented real estate and construction boom that completely altered the physical geography of the principality. Because Monaco was geographically tiny, covering less than 2 square kilometers of steep, rocky terrain, Rainier had to innovate. He earned the nickname the Builder Prince by launching massive engineering projects that reclaimed land directly from the Mediterranean Sea, constructing luxury high-rises, expanding the harbor, and tunneling railways deep into the mountains to free up precious surface real estate. Concrete mixers and towering cranes became permanent fixtures of the skyline. The sleepy, historic Mediterranean town was rapidly paved over, replaced by a dense, glittering metropolis of glass, steel, and luxury penthouses. As the money poured in, the nature of Rainier and Grace's relationship evolved into something resembling a highly efficient corporate partnership. They were the co-CEOs of Monaco Incorporated. In public, they performed their roles with absolute professional perfection. They hosted glittering galas, welcomed foreign heads of state, and turned the Monegasque National Day into a televised festival of royal pageantry. Rainier handled the heavy-handed political negotiations and infrastructure contracts, while Grace managed the cultural diplomacy, charity galas, and public relations. She single-handedly elevated Monaco's social calendar into a high society gauntlet that the global elite paid thousands of dollars just to glimpse. Yet, this relentless commercialization of their lives only widened the emotional chasm between them. The pressure to maintain the illusion of the perfect, wealthy family was suffocating. Every vacation, every walk in the garden, and every family milestone was photographed, packaged, and distributed to the international press to keep the Monaco brand alive. They were living inside a fishbowl of their own creation, where the line between their genuine private lives and their public marketing duties was permanently blurred. Compounding this stress was the turbulent reality of raising their 3 children under the unblinking eye of the paparazzi. Princess Caroline and Prince Albert grew up knowing that their every teenage rebellion, romantic entanglement, and late-night party would be splashed across the covers of European gossip magazines. Caroline, fiercely independent like her mother, frequently clashed with the palace's rigid rules, while the younger Princess Stephanie displayed a wild, rebellious streak that gave the palace public relations team endless nightmares. Grace found herself caught in a grueling, multi-front battle, trying to protect her children from the predatory press, placating her traditionalist husband, and managing her own deep-seated anxiety about the family's safety. By the late 70s, the economic miracle of Monaco was complete. The treasury was overflowing, the country was fully modernized, and its independence from France was entirely secure. Rainier had achieved everything he had set out to do when he stood broke and desperate in the palace gardens 20 years earlier. But the victory felt hollow. The small, romantic Mediterranean principality they had envisioned had become an overcrowded, high-security playground for the ultra-rich, suffocated by paparazzi and concrete. The business partnership had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, but the romance that started it had long since evaporated into a routine of mutual tolerance and separate lives. As the calendar turned to 1982, Grace was entering her 50s. Fighting a quiet battle against aging, weight gain, and a growing sense of purposelessness. She began spending more and more time at the family's private country retreat, Rock Aigle, high up in the mountains above Monaco. It was a modest farm where she could escape the concrete jungle below, bake bread, tend to her gardens, and breathe without a camera in her face. She was desperately looking for a quiet chapter of peace, completely unaware that the very mountains offering her sanctuary were about to stage her final, tragic curtain call. Could a lifetime of keeping up appearances withstand the brutal, unpredictable intervention of fate? The shattered glass. The morning of September 13, 1982, began like any other hot, late summer day on the French Riviera, but a tense energy filled the rooms of Rock Aigle. Princess Grace was preparing to return to Monaco from the family's mountain retreat. Her youngest daughter, 17-year-old Princess Stephanie, was scheduled to start school in Paris in just a few days, and the car was packed to the brim with luggage, hat boxes, and garment bags. The palace chauffeur brought the family's metallic green Rover 3500 to the front door, offering to drive the steep, winding mountain descent. Grace refused. There was too much luggage in the back seat, leaving room for only 2 people. She insisted on driving herself and her daughter down the mountain. It was a seemingly mundane, practical decision that would alter the course of Monegasque history forever. The road connecting Rock Aigle to the principality below was the Route de la Tourbie, a notoriously treacherous, narrow stretch of asphalt carved directly into the sheer rock face of the Alps. It was a road Grace knew intimately. She had driven it hundreds of times over the past 26 years. Ironically, it was the exact same stretch of cliffside where she had filmed a carefree, high-speed driving scene with Cary Grant in Alfred Hitchcock's 1955 film To Catch a Thief, the very movie that had brought her to the French Riviera in the first place. As the Rover made its way down the sharp switchbacks, something went terribly wrong. At approximately 9:45 a.m., as the car approached a particularly sharp hairpin turn known as the Devil's Curse, it didn't slow down. Witnesses driving behind the royal vehicle noted that the brake lights never flashed. Instead of navigating the curve, the heavy British sedan accelerated, smashed through the flimsy stone guardrail, and launched into the air. The car plummeted over a 120-foot cliff, tumbling violently through the trees and rolling several times before crashing upside down in a private garden at the base of the mountain. The wreckage was horrific. Passers-by rushed to the scene to find the Rover completely crushed. Its roof caved in. Princess Stephanie, bruised, bloody, and in deep shock, managed to crawl out of the driver's side window, crying out for her mother. Grace was trapped inside, unconscious, and gravely injured. It took emergency responders nearly an hour to extricate her from the twisted metal. She was rushed to the Monaco hospital, a facility she had spent decades fundraising for, where a frantic team of doctors fought to stabilize her. Back at the palace, Prince Rainier received the news like a physical blow. He rushed to the hospital with Prince Albert and Princess Caroline, plunging into a nightmare of confusion and panic. The initial medical assessment was grim, but the palace, desperate to avoid a global panic and control the narrative, released a heavily minimized statement to the press. They announced that the princess had suffered a broken leg and a collarbone, but was in stable condition. Relying on this optimistic bulletin, the international media reported that Grace had survived. But behind the hospital doors, the reality was fatal. A neurological scan revealed that Grace had not simply lost control of the car. She had suffered a minor stroke, a cerebral vascular accident, while driving. This sudden medical emergency had incapacitated her, causing her foot to press down on the accelerator instead of the brake. The subsequent impact of the crash had caused a massive secondary brain hemorrhage. She was clinically brain dead, kept alive only by life support machines. On the evening of September 14th, after the doctors informed Rainier that there was absolutely no hope of recovery, the prince had to make the most agonizing decision of his life. With his children standing by his side, he gave the order to turn off the machines. Grace Kelly passed away at 10:55 p.m. at the age of 52. The fairy tale was officially over. The announcement of her death sent shockwaves across the globe. In Monaco, an oppressive, disbelief-fueled silence fell over the streets. The flags were lowered to half-staff. The casinos were closed, and shops darkened their windows. The global public, which had watched her step into the palace 26 years earlier as a radiant young bride, could not comprehend that she was gone. The funeral, held on September 18th at the St. Nicholas Cathedral, was a harrowing display of raw, unfiltered human grief. The very church where they had been married before millions was now draped in heavy black velvet. World leaders, Hollywood legends, and European royalty packed the pews, but the world's eyes were fixed on Prince Rainier. The prince was unrecognizable. The fiery, sharp-tongued sovereign had vanished, replaced by a hollow, weeping ghost of a man. His shoulders slouched, his face was pale and swollen, and tears streamed openly down his face as he followed his wife's coffin through the crowded streets. He looked completely shattered, a man whose anchor had been violently ripped away. At the conclusion of the service, as the heavy stone slab was sealed over Grace's tomb, Rainier collapsed into his seat, burying his face in his hands. He had spent his entire adult life building an empire, but in that moment, standing alone in the shadows of the cathedral, he was just a grieving widower facing a vast, empty future.
For those who didn't know your mother, how would you describe her?
She was the most warm, gracious, engaging person, very close to all of us, an incredible mother.
How does a man who gave up everything to build a public illusion survive when the illusion collapses into dust? A fairy tale sold to the public. Prince Rainier III lived for 23 years after the crash, but to those who knew him intimately, a significant part of his spirit died on that mountain road in 1982. The volcanic energy, sharp political focus, and relentless ambition that had defined his early reign evaporated almost overnight, replaced by a quiet, brooding melancholy that he could never quite shake. He never remarried, nor did he ever show the slightest interest in finding another companion to share his life. The sprawling 225-room palace, which had once echoed with the vibrant laughter of Hollywood guests, musicians, and growing children, became a silent, shadow-filled mausoleum dedicated entirely to the memory of his lost wife. In the decades that followed, Rainier turned the entire Principality of Monaco into a living public museum for Grace. He established the world-renowned Princess Grace Rose Garden, carefully planting thousands of her favorite blooms, and commissioned elegant bronze statues of her to be placed throughout the public squares she once walked. Behind the closed, guarded doors of the palace, her private dressing room was left exactly as she had left it on the fateful morning of her final drive, completely untouched by time, as if she might walk back through the door at any moment. As the years wore on, the heavy weight of his grief took a visible toll on the sovereign. The prince aged rapidly before the eyes of his citizens. His dark hair turned snow-white, his once sharp physical frame stooped, and he withdrew increasingly from the demanding spotlight of the public eye. He systematically delegated the daily, complex affairs of state to his son and heir, Prince Albert, preferring instead to withdraw into his own thoughts. He spent his final, quiet years walking his dogs through the palace gardens, often stopping for long stretches of time to stare out over the glittering Mediterranean Sea. When Rainier finally passed away in April 2005 at the age of 81, he was laid to rest in the Grimaldi family vault, placed directly alongside Princess Grace.
The prince died last week after struggling with a failing heart for years. Rainier was laid to rest next to his wife, Princess Grace, in the same cathedral where they were married nearly 50 years ago.
Their matching white marble tombs now sit side by side in the cathedral, drawing thousands of quiet, respectful visitors every single year. The epic story of Rainier and Grace was never the effortless, perfect fairy tale sold to the global public, but it was a profoundly real and moving human drama. It was a complex partnership originally forged in political necessity, deeply strained by the heavy chains of royal duty and the tragic loss of personal identity, but cemented by a deep, enduring bond that only a sudden tragedy could fully reveal to the world. Rainier's life did not take a heartbreaking turn because his marriage was a failure. It took a heartbreaking turn because the grand, glittering illusion they had spent a lifetime building together left him entirely alone in the dark when the curtain finally fell. The glittering fairy tale cost them everything, leaving a legacy built on sacrifice. Rainier and Grace saved a kingdom but lost themselves. For more deep dives into history, subscribe now.